Hello and welcome. Rating agency Crisil recently released a report called State of the Nation, which looked at the larger economy and some of the problems it's facing. It looked at the good and the bad and the ugly, and it looked at the problems which included demand slowdown, some of the good aspects which included agricultural growth and what it could turn into. Let's understand this a little better with Crisil's chief economist DK Joshi, who now joins us to give us a sense on what this report means and what we can take away, including the good and the bad and the ugly. So, Mr. Joshi, let's begin with the fundamental problems in the economy and something that require urgent attention from all people concerned. What are they?
Well, I think the most fundamental problem is our external vulnerability. I think our current account deficit has only been rising, which has increased our vulnerability to external shocks. And we have seen that play out in the month of August when the rupee depreciated very sharply.
Right.
So I think from an emergency perspective, that is the biggest problem that we face. I think right now there is some calm, but if the Fed starts its tapering again, or there are noises that it is going to start its tapering again, then we could again see it impact our currency very adversely. And rupee could be again very volatile. So I think that is from an emergency perspective. But I think if you move from the emergency, there are other emergencies that are building up. I mean, which is, for instance, the manufacturing sector or the industrial growth in the economy. Industry has been slowing down very, very significantly, and we now expect it to slow down to 1%. Now, industry is the most labor-intensive sector. Over the years, what we have seen is that it's not only it's slowing down, but its ability to absorb labor has also been going down. So there are a lot of worrying things on the industrial front. I think we need to address that. I think that's very critical going ahead.
So we were assuming that industry contributes about 15 to 16% of GDP. Services contributes a larger chunk, more than 50%, and therefore to some extent betting on services to take us through any phase, whether good or bad. What you're saying now is, I think that services too is directly linked to manufacturing, and perhaps we are not cognizant of this as much as we should be.
Well, I think it is, they are quite closely linked. I mean, when industry is not doing well, services also can't do well. I mean, that's more or less given. If you look at the interrelationship between them, what we found that a decade back, for instance, I think you required 0.36 inputs, units of service input to produce 1 unit of industrial output. Today you require 0.44. What it essentially means is the service sector intensity of manufacturing activity has increased. So obviously it will spill over. And what will services cater to? I mean, whether you take hotels, trade, restaurants, they all cater in some sense to the industrial activity. And I think when the incomes slow down, obviously these sectors also start bearing the brunt of that.
So is it also obviously a policy failure to see or to overemphasize the importance of services?
I won't say that. I mean, services has helped us quite a bit in the last couple of years, but I think what is becoming evident that I think services is not an engine that can fly on its own. I mean, it requires, I think if the other part of the economy is not doing well, you cannot expect the ITS sector alone to lift such a large part of the economy. I mean, it's only a small part of overall, it would be less than 8% of GDP. So I think the point there is that everything is at this juncture looking down. I mean, the only thing that's looking up is agriculture. That's the lone driver this year. If you look at industry and services, which is about 86% of total GDP, that is going to be worse than what it was.
So I'm going to come to agriculture in a moment. Let's look at the other aspect, which is perhaps either the bad or the ugly in the economy, which is inflation, right? Steadily rising. Broadly, why has it been rising, and what are the components that have caused it to rise the most?
Well, I think what's interesting is that I think what we do is you can divide inflation into noise component and a signal component. I think signal would be the demand-driven inflation, when the demand is exceeding the supply. That is measured through core inflation, for instance. The other things like food, etc., or fuel, they are regarded as noise. At this juncture, what is happening is that you kept a lot of prices suppressed, particularly the fuel prices. They have to be released. So I think that is going to cause pressure on inflation, whether it is diesel or it is electricity, for quite some time. So that pressure is building up.
So that's about the future. But why did it come to where we are today, which is
because we did not raise them. I mean, we did not raise electricity prices for a long time, and I think that led to the poor performance of state electricity boards. Somebody has to foot the bill, and eventually I think the burden was falling on the government. And because the fiscal situation is bad, there is no alternative but to lift the prices of these segments. It's going to be good in the medium run.
You're saying inflation is rising because prices prices of certain goods and services which should have been raised have not been raised, including fuel.
That's right. I think that is one part. There's other part where I think the prices are rising artificially. I mean, which is the food. I mean, for instance, you have such high stocks of rice and wheat. Why is the food inflation or the cereal inflation still in double digits? I think there are problems with agriculture itself. I mean, you need to increase productivity, particularly in protein segment. But I think overall, the kind of food stocks we have, the food inflation should not be. So there is also about management. I mean, the inflation should have been much lower. I mean, it has to be much lower.
So how much of inflation is food in India?
Food is, I think, depends on whether you take wholesale price index or you take consumer price
so
index.
Let's start with wholesale.
I think in wholesale price index, it has a very small percentage, I think less than 15%. But in consumer prices, the new index that has been constructed, it is pretty large. I mean, almost about 50%.
So what affects you and me more?
Well, I think it depends on which income bracket you are. I mean, if you, the higher you go up the income bracket, the food inflation affects you less and less.
Right.
I think you can do a dipstick test. I mean, if you talk to an auto wala, he'll say, I spend 85% of my income on food. If you talk to CEO of a company, he'll say maybe 1% or so. So I think it varies.
Yeah.
But I think what we get from these indices is the national average. I mean, and you know, averages mask a lot of variations in the system. So I think from an average perspective, inflation is rising. It is rising more. Food inflation hurts the poor more. I think it's a tax on them. There's no doubt about it. And fuel inflation affects almost everybody, but obviously those the middle class will have. I mean, who will be affected much more.
Right. So food, as you saying it or as you are describing it, is a supply side problem, right? We're not able to manage our stocks. We're not able to distribute food or grow them or manage our supply chains, and therefore consumers are facing the brunt.
That is one aspect of one way of looking at it. The second way is in the last few years we've also created more demand for food. I mean, the rural wages, etc., have been rising very fast, right? And I think that has created demand for proteins, etc. What is interesting there is that if you look at the inflation in protein category, it has gone up almost 100% between 2004-05 and 2009-10. But if you look at the protein consumed per person, that hasn't hardly gone up. I mean, that is almost stable. So the point there is that people have got higher income, so they are somehow willing to pay higher prices. But the demand is high for these items, so the prices keep rising.
Right. So let's take a step back then, and as a component of inflation, understand food better. The problem seems to be that tastes and needs have changed, right?
Yes.
People are consuming different kinds of foods and are demanding different kinds of foods
Absolutely.
across the spectrum,
Absolutely.
not just well-to-do, but even someone who's economically backward.
Absolutely. I think poor people move from the cereals to proteins very quickly the moment there's a lift in their income. And I think that is why you see milk prices, if you look at eggs, meat, fish, I think all of them have been in very high inflation zone for last couple of years. So there has been a shift towards these. So there is more demand for them. And since you don't have enough supplies, the prices keep rising. People are not cribbing right now because their incomes, particularly the poorer people's, the rural wages have risen by 17-18% for casual workers. So I think that has...
Does that link again to agriculture, to which we'll come back?
I think it links to also to some extent to Narega, in the sense that the proclivity of workers to go out of their hometowns and work outside reduced. So that's why there was a shortage of workers in some categories, which might not be so much this year because I think economy itself is slowing down. But in the last couple of years, yes, I think rural wages have risen fast. The pace of increase in rural wages has definitely slowed down this year.
Okay, so you talked about the cereal to protein transition, right? And in India, which is causing this food inflation or pushing food inflation. How have other countries managed this? Because they too must have seen developed countries who've seen this kind of transition.
Well, I think protein consumption, I think particularly in Asia, I think as a part of even meat consumption has been rising. And I think what needs to be done is that you need to shore up the supplies of these things. I think you need to have enough investments there. And I think that's what we are lacking. In milk, the production is rising, but the demand for milk is rising. So that's why every time you go to the market, you see a higher price tab on the milk. I think that essentially means that you have to shore up your production. I think that the only way to do it is through enhancing production.
Or imports.
Or imports. I know.
Or increased imports.
That's right.
So where do we stand on that? Again, as components of food, where do we stand on either increasing supply, increasing imports, or adjusting the policies to do that?
Well, I think it's a large economy. I mean, and the moment we go out to import too much, I think that will have an impact on global. We have seen it play out in rice and wheat. Whenever we try to import, the global prices tend to go up. So I think from that perspective, it has to be dealt with domestically. I think more than, and I think surprisingly, the agriculture is the only sector where we have a trade surplus. I mean, in most of the sectors we have a trade deficit. I mean, we export more than we import in agriculture.
Right. So, what are the other components of inflation, or is there any other critical component of inflation which we need to touch upon before we move on to?
Well, I think inflation we have fairly covered. I think in nutshell, I think what we are trying to say is that what is typically regarded as noise, or I think which is central bankers typically don't look at them. In India's case, what has happened is that the whether it is fuel or it is food, this shock is not one time. It is a persistent shock. The food inflation in India has averaged about 10% in the last 7 years. The decade before that, it was 5%. So there has been a fundamental shift up in food. So that, I think, that feeds into your expectations. If you tell somebody that food inflation is going to come down in the next 2 years, I don't think many people will believe it. And even the RBI surveys, earlier surveys used to show that people have high expectations. So it builds into your expectation. After experiencing high inflation, you start believing that it's here to stay, particularly for food. I mean, that's true.
Right. So let's talk about demand slowdown now. We touched upon it. You talked about industry being in bad shape. You talked about growth being at 1%, and a lot of the investment that's come in really in some ways absorbing jobs, as in it's not being able to create new jobs. It's
that's
actually
right.
Because it's more capital intensive, and maybe there's more automation and so on. What is the future looking? Future as in the near future. What is it looking like? Is it cyclical? Could it be non-cyclical and therefore something more permanent?
Part of it is cyclical because the economy is in a slow move. So I think people there'll be layoffs, etc. But part of it is also structural. I mean, if your industry's ability to absorb labor is reducing, it's not cyclical. I mean, that's something that is,
and that's a global trend.
Yeah, but I think we have, for an economy which is going to add 12 million every year to the workforce, I think this trend is not healthy, because you have to eject people out of agriculture. Where will they find employment? I mean, not all can be absorbed in services. So the low skill worker has to find an employment in industrial sector or manufacturing sector, and that I think is a big challenge for us. You can't keep feeding them through subsidies for long. I mean, you have to have a self-sustaining employment in the economy.
Right. So, what's the reason for the demand slowdown? I mean, in the way that you would look at it.
Overall, I think if you look at the economy, what happened was, I think, let me take you through after the Lehman crisis, because it's 5 years. I think we have completed 5 years of Lehman crisis, so people are looking. What happened after the crisis was that the economy lifted very quickly because a lot of stimulus was applied. The stimulants, whether it is fiscal policy, government programs were more consumption oriented, they were pushing the economy up, and interest rates were cut sharply. And that led to a sharp increase in growth, and we actually reached 9% within 2 years. But after that, what happened was the reality started biting. I mean, inflation started picking up because of your demand at that time did exceed the supply, and the fiscal situation started worsening. As a result of that, there had to be pullback on both. I mean, so monetary policy became restrictive, which essentially means that interest rates started rising, and fiscal policy had to be contractionary, which means in the sense that the fiscal deficit to GDP needed to be reduced, and Mr. Chidambaram actually did reduce it last year. So what happens when you take this stimulant or the steroid of any individual? I mean, unless his body is healthy, the system will collapse. I mean, so you weaned off the fiscal and monetary stimulus, but the private sector at the same time was not in a position to take the space vacated by the absence of the stimulus. And as a consequence, I'm talking of private investments. You look at the pipeline for investments, everything has narrowed quite a bit. So in a situation where private sector was not able to accelerate on its own without the stimulus, I think you were in a situation where economy had to be slowed down. Private sector, by the way, contributes about 75% to India's GDP, and private corporate investments have been hit really very hard, I mean, in the last couple of years.
And for a lot of other reasons.
So absence of stimulus and inability of the rest of the economy to accelerate on its own because of a vitiated investment climate, I would say. I think that has led to this very sharp slowdown. And on top of that,
demand.
Yeah, overall demand is GDP. I mean, so
okay.
yeah.
Right. No, when I also, my question also sort of extends to consumer demand, and I'm assuming that's
absolutely.
what's
I think if you look at the demand GDP from the demand side, I think what you notice is that the private consumption demand growth, which averaged around 8% over the last 6 to 7 years, I think that was at 1.6% in the last quarter. So that is about almost 60% of GDP. I mean, the private consumption. So that has taken a major hit.
And that's really all about sentiment?
That is about
or partly a large extent.
It's also your incomes are slowing. I mean, because I think what happens in consumption, particularly the slowdown has happened in more in the categories where you exercise your discretion, which is a durable consumption, whether you're buying a car or you're buying durable goods. In that category, what typically happens when you have uncertainty of income or uncertainty of jobs, you start pulling back, and I think that's exactly what we are seeing.
But is that something? So, for instance, organized sector is about 7%. The 93% is really unorganized sector employment.
Yeah.
So, are you saying that all this applies to all the 100% of organized and unorganized, the way they're consuming, or the way they stopped consuming?
I think what happens is that for the high-end consumer items, it is the organized, obviously. But if the organized segment is, I think what the organized segment does today, it also outsources to the unorganized segment.
Right.
So I think this slows down, that also slows down. So it does spill over to the unorganized in some way. And I think the only good thing this year is that the rural part of the economy, from the consumption perspective, will hold on. That is why we expect the tractor demand or the two-wheeler demand, which is rural oriented, to do better than. But otherwise, automobiles are in the red zone right now. I mean, and they.
So I was interviewing Sunil Kant Munjal of Joint Managing Director of Hero Motor just a couple of days ago, and he was saying the same thing. He felt that very strong agricultural turnaround and demand plus festival season is going to be a clear kicker for demand, at least for this year.
That's right.
The latter part of this year.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it cannot sustain growth over a long term. But yeah, I think during the time when no cylinder is firing, I mean, at least this one is going to create.
So let's talk a little more about the agriculture side, right? So you're saying that it could go from 1.9% to 4.5%, which is a conservative estimate, or it actually could go more? Depends.
I think we have to wait, because agriculture is very unpredictable. It's not about rains and its distribution alone. It's also about the pests and many other things. I mean, so we have. But otherwise, the signals right now are that the agriculture this year should be good, and 4.5 is a reasonable estimate, I would say. We have seen agriculture go up to 7.9% also in this decade. I mean, when over last year was bad, so statistically there is going to be some lift, and then you have an exceptionally good monsoon. I mean, well distributed. So that's going to help this year.
Yeah. So now that we are all looking at the rain gods, or thanking the rain gods, now that the monsoons have ended almost, for helping us through this patch, what does this mean? I mean, so you talked about tractors, two-wheelers, and so on. But what could this better agriculture output and demand mean for the whole economy, and to what extent can it save it from the rest of our problems?
Yeah, agriculture is only about 14% of GDP. So 86% of the GDP is going to grow at a slower rate than last year. So this doesn't have the muscle to offset the headwinds that you see in services and industry. But yeah, I think if to give you a indication of what it can do is, suppose agriculture surprises much more on the positive side and it grows at 6% instead of 4.5, then overall GDP goes up to 5.2% in our estimate. But I think, yeah, in a bad year, it's very good news. I mean, because there's no other. I mean, at least gods have been kind.
Yeah. No. Okay. So, but agriculture also employs the most people in this country. More than half.
That's right.
56%. Is that correct?
I think Yeah. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a large
substantial part of our population.
Absolutely. Almost around 60% is in agriculture.
Right. So to that extent, what you're saying means that at least more than half our population will in some way be taken care of, despite the fact that
to some extent, yes. Because some part of it also depends on if the urban part is not doing well. I think there's a growing linkage between urban and rural. I mean, so that part will play out, obviously. But I think what is important to remember here is, the large part of the population, both because of good agriculture and also I think the government expenditure, if you look at this year, I think it's still in favor of rural areas than urban areas. So I think that's also going to help.
Right. So let me ask you about as we come to a close. I mean, the next 6 months. I mean, there is, and I'm only saying 6 months because there's elections, and that's the end of the runway, so to speak, for this government, and we've not put sufficient thrust, as it turns out. So what can be done to revive what is not doing well, and what are the things that people as observers should be watching for closely?
Well, I think one thing that is really crippling and which should be turned around, and there's some movement there, is the mining. I mean, mining sector hasn't been doing well at all.
Yeah,
and
because it's been shut down. In most places.
Absolutely, and there is close linkage of mining with manufacturing. Right. I mean, so it spills over to. So if you this is a low-hanging fruit to me. I mean, if you sort out the issues in mining, which I think some of them are getting sorted out. If you do that, then I think there will be an immediate lift to growth, because mining has been contracting for last year. So there's going to be and we are importing iron ore today, which we used to export. I mean, and that's not only slowing the economy, it's also adding to external pressures.
Correct.
So I think that is one segment. As far as the reforms are concerned, I think there have been positive action, but as I said, I mean, we were talking, I mean, if you start revving up the engines at the end of the runway, it's very difficult to make the plane fly off. I mean, but at least it's revving up. I mean, that is the good news. If you look at in totality, from the policy side, most of the movements have been on the positive side, so that helps create the sentiment. But I think the problems facing the economy require much more effort than clearing the projects is another thing that we should be closely watching, and whether the project pipeline, so to say, is beginning to replenish or not. I think that to me would be more critical.
And in some ways, the message I'm taking from what you're saying is that we seem to have lost sight of and on the real economy, and it's time to now bring attention back in more ways than one.
Absolutely. I think if you right now investment climate is not that healthy. I mean, because demand has also slowed down very significantly. So reviving investments is going to be the biggest challenge, particularly the private corporate investment, which is the most productive investment in the economy.
Right, DK Joshi. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.